where I get to take my mask off. Morning, everybody. I want to talk to you about the enclosure today. No, wait a minute. Back her up one. I'll tell you when to go. The Hebrew word enclosure is translated into English garden. Probably didn't know that, did you? Now we have open gardens, some of us, and those of us that do have an open garden have a problem with rabbits and deer and squirrels and chipmunks and all that kind of thing. Now, in biblical times, gardens were enclosed, and usually in the middle of the garden was a fig tree back in those days. And when the hoeing would get rough, they would lay down under their fig tree. And that's why in the Old Testament it says, in that day everyone will lay under their vine and under their fig tree, which means in their garden, and nobody will make them afraid. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about the river. We talked about the river last week, but this is a completely different take on it. And I want to talk to you about the creation story, and I want to talk to you about it in a completely metaphorical way. And so let's go. Okay, please. Out of the ground the Lord God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now notice that there are trees in the garden that don't necessarily have fruit, but they're pleasant to the sight. And there's a lot of beautiful trees that we have in the springtime when they flower out. We have our flowering crab and our flowering plum and all of these beautiful flowering trees. And then also in the garden were trees that were good for fruit. Now I want you to know that fruit and nuts are not differentiated in the Bible. A nut is a fruit as far as the Bible is concerned. And so we have all kinds of nut trees. You know, by the way, if you want walnuts, there's about 500 million of them in the back lawn out there. Nobody ever takes it. And there's some hickories. I don't think they've fallen yet. But if you want some, they're out. They just go to waste. On a little bit of a side note, I was noticing that in the back lawn, there are places where there are walnut trees that are growing right next to other walnut trees. I mean, like within an inch. And the reason for that is when the lawnmower comes along and mows the rest of it, they get cut off. But the ones that are unfortunate enough to fall right next to a walnut tree, they're growing. There's a big walnut and a small walnut, almost touching it. We have to cut those down so that we can mow better. But there are all kinds of nuts out there. My grandfather he had 5 or 6 walnut trees, and he used to pick up every single one. And he would get the husk off of them. And if you ever come to my house, look on my china cabinet, there's a walnut limb with the bark on it, and it's hollowed out, and there's a nutcracker and a nut pick in it. That was his, and it was always full because he appreciated whatever it was. He was a Depression guy, and he'd appreciate whatever free food that he could get, and the nuts were among it. So there are good, pleasant to look at trees. There are trees for good food. There's the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And I would submit to you that this is, metaphorically speaking, about our life too. I mean, we Bible believers tend to, teach this as a 6-day creation and a day of rest. But there's a lot more to this than just that. And if you want to look at it metaphorically, we can really draw some personal insight from it, because within us, we all are aware that we have some good things and we have some evil things. Are we right? We know what the secrets are. And we've also have the tree of life because we have knowledge of Jesus Christ. And inside of our little sphere, inside of our little garden, so to speak, there are things that are pleasant to look at, and there are fruits that are pleasant to eat. And so that's kind of where I'm going with this. Go ahead, please. The Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. So in this story, we have the earth which produces fruit, and we have the earth which produces human beings as well. And Jesus talked about fruits and human beings, did he not? So, I mean, there is really a metaphorical lesson in this. So we are people of the earth, and we have the ability to allow things to grow within us. There was a guy named Crandall Miller who was a professor of some sort. I guess he was a philosophy professor, and he used to come into class every single day and say this. He would stand up in front of the podium and he'd say, "What you feed grows, what you starve dies." And, you know, whenever I think about the guy, that's what I think. You know, I can't tell you any lesson that he taught because, you know, what good does philosophy do me? And so what you feed grows, what you starve dies. What you fertilize grows, what you pull out dies. And so if we are from the earth, and the earth is producing good fruit, and the earth is also producing thistles and thorns, we have to be a gardener within our own lives. Go ahead, please. You will know them by their fruits. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes. Now, I want you to understand that we have scientific definitions of things. And we would not think necessarily that a grapevine is a tree. But in biblical thinking, it is. It's something that produces, it grows out of the ground, and it has fruit. The same thing is true with, we would say a whale is not a fish, a whale is a mammal. But in the biblical way of thinking, if it's in the water and it swims, it's a fish. So they didn't have those kind of differentiations that we have today, because they didn't really have the ability to examine the whale's mammals, so to speak. But they didn't understand anything about hot-blooded and cold-blooded or anything in those days. It was in the ocean. So here Jesus says, "You will know them by their fruits. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor figs from thistles. Every tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire." Ouch! Well, when we plant trees, we have to be careful, don't we? I mean, I've tried to plant apple trees, I've tried to plant cherry trees, and if it's a cold winter and the thing is new, the rabbits come and they chew the bark right off of it and it's dead. Or the deer come along and chew the bark right off of it and it's dead. So you have to take care of the fruit tree even in the off season. You have to be sure to look after whatever it is that you've planted. And Jesus said that we can be known by our fruit. And one fruit necessarily isn't a fruit in our way of thinking, is that which looks good. A nice tree, a flowering plum, a tulip tree, or something like that. So we can look at this and we say, this can be our personal life, this can be our enclosure in our church, but the idea is that there is good and evil, and we must starve the evil and fertilize the good. Go ahead, please. Thorns and thistles it shall grow for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. Now, I can't find much use for a thistle, although a thistle does have a beautiful purple flower on it, but it's not easily handled. And I can remember my grandfather. He was so meticulous with his garden and with his lawn. And he had a beautiful sandy loam lawn right on the Irondequoit Creek, and there wasn't a rock in his garden at all. And he had this tool and he would see a little teeny thistle come up, and he would go into the garage and get this forked tool that he could get down and get that root out, because if you don't get the root, you don't get the thistle. And I can still see him running in and getting that thing and getting that thistle out of his lawn. And we ought to be the same way when something that's not helpful is starting to grow in our life. We need to weed that garden. We need to have an enclosure around that garden. There has to be some protection between what's out there and what's in here, because there's a lot out there. A lot of things out there, not things that don't edify. Just look on the internet, the things that are available on the internet. There's all kinds of hate, there's pornography, there's all kinds of stuff that we really should not allow inside of our life, and we should get it out of there, because there is good and there is evil, and we need a good garden with good fruit and with pleasant flowers and beautiful flowers. But there is a use for thorns and thistles, and that is for a hedge. Now I don't know what those two plants we have out in the front are, but they're there for decoration for us, but that is the kind of a plant that would go around the garden in biblical times. They didn't have the nice power to cut them. And so they would plant thistles and thorns in their garden, but they would plant them around the edge to keep the animals out. And you got to make some good use. Why did God create the thorn bush? Well, why did he create the fly? And bats need something to eat too. I mean, there's some sort of a balance in nature. And so the thorns are to keep that which doesn't belong in the garden out. And so God's, in the Old Testament, the Jewish nation is likened unto a vineyard. And in Isaiah it says, let me tell you the story about the vineyard. And it's the guy, he planted the choice vine, and he planted the fig tree, and he put a stone wall around, and then it produced worthless grapes. Now he's talking about Israel at that time, people of God who were doing all kinds of bad stuff, because they weren't taking these bad things out of their life. They were allowing these bad things to grow within their lives. And so God said, what should I do to those people? Well, I'm going to take the hedge of thorns away, and I'm going to allow the Babylonians to come in and punish them. That's what this passage is about. But the idea I wanted to show you is that the garden has this boundary around it, and we want to make sure that that boundary stays there, that the thistles and thorns are on the outside, and it protects what's on the inside, and that they not be on the inside. Go ahead, please. Now here's something that it says in the same context. The river flows out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divides and becomes 4 branches. Can I see the next one, please? Now this is not a literal river. It can't be. Because this river flows out of the garden and becomes 4 rivers. There's no such river on the earth that's like that. Rivers have tributaries that flow in, and then they flow out. In this case, I've shown the Mississippi River and tributaries, and it's amazing that Illinois River it starts within a couple miles of Lake Michigan. And so there has to be some sort of a ridge there where that flows to the south, and it doesn't flow to the north into the Great Lakes system. If it flowed into the Great Lakes system, then the water would come out through Lake Ontario and out the St. Lawrence. But it doesn't. It flows into the Mississippi, which comes, way up there near the Lake Superior. And all of these rivers, the Ohio flows into the Mississippi, and the Allegheny River flows into the Ohio, and what's the other one? The Monongahela flows in at Pittsburgh. The Allegheny and those two rivers flow into the Ohio, and then the Ohio flows into the Mississippi, and it all goes down into the Delta, the Mississippi Delta. So in every case, the waters flow that way, but this river out of Eden flows out and becomes four rivers. It flows the opposite way. And a lot of times Christianity flows the opposite way, and if you don't believe it, try to talk Christianity in our culture in a political context, and see if you are not flowing the opposite way of what people think. So the garden contains the beautiful tree, and the garden contains the good fruit. And as the river goes out of that garden, it goes out to the people, and in the opposite way, which I thought was kind of neat. Go ahead, please. And he told them many things in parables, he being Jesus. Listen, the sower went out to sow. Seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. So the disciples said, please explain it to us. For that which was sown among thorns is the one who hears the word. This is the biggest danger for American Christians. The cares of the world, the lure of wealth, choke out the word. If the thorn is not in the right place, keeping the bad from coming in, and the thorn is within the garden, and it grows, it'll choke out the fruit. We have this thing called succession. We have to teach it in the hunter safety course. So if we have a plowed field, after a few years it starts to grow goldenrod. And then it starts to grow weed trees, usually with thorns on them. And then it grows up over a number of years, it grows up into a complete thorn field. And then eventually some of the bigger trees start to grow up above the thorns. And as they grow, it's thorny and it's small trees. And as the trees grow, the canopy comes over and it chokes out the thorns underneath, and it becomes a forest. If you've lived around here very long, you can know as you go towards Hopewell on County Road 4, when you get to the rotary there, on the right, when we moved into our house in Hopewell in 1981, that was an open plowed field. And over the years it came through that succession. And you drive there today, there are small trees in it, and in another 20 years the trees will choke out the thorns. But you can't walk through there anymore because nobody took care of taking those thorns out. Nobody planted what needed to be planted, and it went back to the earth. And of course that's necessary, because if that didn't happen, I'm talking about in a ecological sense, if that didn't happen, the winds would blow the dirt all over the place. So there has to be something to hold the soil in place. When they took all the soil out in the Midwest, it caused the Dust Bowl. Did you ever learn about the Dust Bowl in school? They took out all the hedgerows and all the trees, and was it in the 20s, Priscilla, or 30s? When did that happen? 30s. I couldn't hear a word you're saying with that mask on. During the Depression era. And the reason there was nothing to hold the soil, and it just blew all over the place. So there's need for, if you don't have the right trees planted, you don't have the right crops planted, And nothing, if you don't do anything for a while, you could get soil erosion, and that'd be a really bad thing too. So God knew that that was necessary to have these things grow in there. But in our lives, if we let those bad things grow in our lives, that's really bad. And if we let those bad things grow in our church, and our enclosure becomes infested with thorns, now nobody wants to walk through thorns. Nobody wants to come in and get pricked by thorns in our congregation. And so we have to be very careful and make sure that we get those things out when they're small, because they come out nice and easy when they're small. But if we're too lazy to pull those out, if we let pornography, for example, get a hold of our soul, that's a very hard thing to break. Or if we let drug addiction get a hold of our soul, that's a very hard thing to break. Or if, anything that is against God and against good wisdom, we need to get those things out of our life, because we are a garden and we are an enclosure. I don't know if there's anything else there or not. There isn't. Are there any comments on this? Yes, Keith.
Well, when you're talking about our lives, in order to see the weeds in the garden, you have to go into the garden and examine it closely with big eye. And that's like our lives. We have to examine our lives, our walk. Be honest with where we're at and get rid of those weeds. Because if you overlook them, instead of what they go, he would suffer with addiction.
Yes, sir. Anyone else? Can you believe it? I'm actually getting these things done by 11:15. I looked at it, I said, that's not a long enough sermon. And then I thought, well, maybe it is. Go pull some weeds, grow some fruit, and show some beauty, because you are a garden. God bless. Have a great day.